All right, thank you everyone for joining me for these live internet studies. My name is Ariel Ben Lyman Hanavi. As you can see on your screen right now, these live internet studies are broken up into two segments. The first segment you see on your screen is Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. We are talking about things related to end-time topics. Right now, we're actually talking about the rapture, but we are eventually going to be doing a study on the book of Revelation. That's where this study is going. As you can see on your screen, the second segment is a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism, and it is a look at topics related to Trinity as seen through the perspective of biblical Unitarian, and of course we biblical Trinitarians are challenging that particular perspective. Right now we're in a verse in the Old Testament in the book of Isaiah, and we're just asking ourselves the question, who is the Savior? And we're looking at that topic now. Okay, let's turn to Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. Here's the topical index that I'm utilizing for these particular studies, for this particular segment. This is on making a case for the pre-wrath rapture. As you can see, topic 11 is where we're at right now in the weekly schedule. I say weekly because we have these studies weekly, but it's taking a while to get through each topic, and that's by design. There are four basic views of the rapture. As far as I can tell, these four views are held by most people in Christian circles, so I'll just rattle them off for you real quick. There's the pre-trib view. Pre-tribulationism believes that the rapture, in relationship to what we might call a 7-year tribulation model, is at the beginning of that 7 years. Then next on the list is what's called a mid-trib. Mid-tribulation takes that same 7 years of tribulation, and it places the rapture right in the middle of that time frame. The pre-wrath model, which is third on the list here, takes that same 7-year time frame, but actually doesn't call it tribulation, but it recognizes that there's 7 years, and it puts the rapture sometime after the midpoint, but before the final end of the 7 years. We'll get more details later, don't worry. And then the final post-trib view on this list takes that same 7-year tribulation period. It may or may not call it 7 years of tribulation, but it recognizes a 7-year time frame, and it places the rapture at the farthest right, at the very end of the 7 years. This is what we could call classic post-tribulationism. All right, as we look at these same four views, the first three on the list that I already mentioned, pre-trib, mid-trib, and pre-wrath, they all kind of look the same on this chart as they did on the previous chart. But this particular chart shows another version of the post-trib, pre-wrath. Yes, you heard me right. Post-trib, pre-wrath. So it's a version of post-trib, but we add the label pre-wrath with it. And what it does is, if you notice very carefully, in that 7-year period, at the very end, on the first chart, we had Day of the Lord, and then we had Rapture. But now, if you notice, they've swapped places. The rapture comes first, and then the day of the Lord is poured out. And this effectively creates what this version of post-trib believes is a rapture that takes place before judgment, final judgment's poured out. And that's why they call themselves post-trib pre-wrath. Some people call it a hybrid model of post-trib with pre-wrath, because if you look at the two bottom versions, post-trib pre-wrath on the left and pre-wrath proper on the right, then you'll notice that mainly the difference between them is the length of the day of the Lord. The post-trib pre-wrath model on the left has the day of the Lord being about 24 hours. Some models show this time frame to be maybe 30 days, 45 days, 75 days, either way a shortened time period. By comparison, the pre-wrath model on the right side of this screen that you're looking at has the day of the Lord is definitely a bit longer. It's not 3.5 years. It's not 7 years. It could be maybe a year long, something like that. But those are the four views that we're working from. Here's another view of another look at the pre-wrath rapture, the view that I'm actually purporting, the view that I hold to right now. So now let me just give a little more detail, and then we'll jump right into the study. Here's the 7 years in front of us, essentially 7 years. There really is, at the end of the far right of the chart where it says second coming, there really is about 30 and 45 more days, a month, and then another month and a half tacked on the end, so equaling 75 days past the 7 years. But I'm not showing that on this chart. This is kind of an overview of the main events connected with this particular view. Something that's very definitive of this view is that the first 3.5 years is not labeled tribulation. It's simply labeled beginning of sorrows, or birth pangs is another way that you'll see it show up in the Bible. At the midpoint, the abomination of desolation is initiated. It starts up at that point in time. We could also consider that, according to this view, the Great Tribulation itself also starts up at the midpoint in conjunction with the abomination of desolation, both at the midpoint. What ends up happening then is the Great Tribulation runs for an indeterminate length of time, an unknown length of time, but something that's very important to this view is that the Great Tribulation is interrupted by the rapture, the pre-wrath rapture, and it gains its name from the fact that it is prior to the wrath of God that is poured out for the rest of the 70th week, meaning the day of the Lord and God's wrath are the same thing. So truly, this is also pre-wrath, post-trib, if we argue that tribulation is that short period of time that initiates at the midpoint and then is interrupted sometime during the second half of the midpoint. But even though we don't know how long the Great Tribulation will go, it is interrupted, as Yeshua said, unless those days were cut short. Those days of tribulation is the context of that statement by Yeshua in Matthew chapter 24. And then moving from left to right, the second coming is on the far right of the chart, which creates, as you'll notice, a gap between the pre-wrath rapture on the front end of God's wrath and the second coming on the back end of God's wrath. We still have one event known as God's wrath, or the day of the Lord, or the Parousia, as we're going to find in other charts. And yet, there are two, what can we call it, bookends connected with the one event. There are two details that are primary. There are two occurrences of significant activity, two activities, primary activities, if you want to call it that, that are associated with God's wrath. One being at the initiation of God's wrath at the front, that's the pre-wrath rapture. Of course, don't forget that that includes resurrection. And then at the far end, second coming, which would pull in details like Battle of Armageddon, but it's necessary to have a gap of time between these two, and yet at the same time, they are recognized as one second coming, or one coming of Christ back to planet Earth. So these are very important details. In fact, let me do something for you and show you what this might look like on a different chart that I created. Give me a moment. I don't want that chart. I want this chart. Where did I put it? Here we go. So if I take this particular chart that I created and just show you the slice known as the Day of the Lord, keeping in mind that we're talking about this time frame as well. Make sure I'm on the right slide. There we go. This time frame where you see on the left side of your screen where it says God's wrath, Day of the Lord, and pre-wrath rapture, it has a white arrow pointing up and then a black arrow pointing down. And then to the far right, there's second coming with a single black arrow pointing down. If I were to zoom in on that section and make it look like this slide, then just notice that, first of all, this section is only the day of the Lord. It is not the entire 70th week. What I want you to walk away with is that this part of the 70th week of Daniel, where we're describing the day of the Lord, it is initiated by the rapture, and it basically concludes with the second coming, although if we want to talk about the day of the Lord extending into the millennium and things like that, i.e. the coming of Messiah extending into that, there's a case that could be made there. But primarily, the concentrated part of the wrath of God is poured out during the day of the Lord, which is a short time period. So this is Yeshua's Parousia. It's one single coming, yet two significant events that are connected with that one single coming. This day of the Lord, this rapture, this time frame commences sometime after the midpoint of the week, after the Great Tribulation, and after the sixth seal sign. God's wrath that we're looking at here includes both the trumpets and the bowls, but not the seals. If you want to say it includes seal number 6 and 7, I'm fine with that as well. But primarily, it doesn't include the seals. Mainly, it focuses on the trumpets and the bowls that show up afterwards. So it's one coming, it's one single coming, and yet it's got two significant events connected to it. I refer to them as bookends. And this is important when you compare it over and against, say, the pre-trib model that we saw earlier. Let me show you that model one more time. If you look at this version, the pre-trib model has the rapture all the way at the very beginning of the 7 years, and the second coming all the way at the very end of the 7 years. And because of the nature of the way that the rapture is described as this anytime secret event that is actually not part of the tribulation, and it's very important that pre-tribbers keep Christians out of the tribulation itself, out of the 7 years, which means in their model, the rapture really isn't part of the 7 years if the entire 7 years is the tribulation. In their model, it's important to keep Christians out of the tribulation, and therefore it happens anytime without any warning, and it doesn't have anything connected to it like, say, any other events, although shortly after the rapture, God's tribulation, God's wrath commences. This is true. But in the way that they describe their secret anytime imminent rapture, which is definitely not connected to any tribulation, it gives me the impression that we're talking about an event that is not in any way connected with the second coming or God's wrath. And this effectively creates what many people recognize as a second and a third coming. So that's something that the Bible doesn't describe, and so it creates a weakness for this position. So I think that's something worth taking notice of. All right, so let's move into my study. We're dealing with a book written by a gentleman by the name of AARON EGGMAN. He's a Christian, and he's a pre-wrather like myself. And he wrote a book entitled The Saints Go Up and the Wrath Comes Down. You can see on your screen right now that it is available on his website. Well, it's available for purchase through links that he's referring to on his website, such as Amazon or paperback or color paperback. But he does also provide several excerpts from the book on his website for free. Resources such as blogs that we're going to be utilizing here in a moment. Resources such as graphics from the book, and he created a PowerPoint slide, and he even created a video. And so he's got a lot of resources that are available for free. Even if you don't buy the book, you can go to his website at prewrathresources.wordpress.com and utilize those resources. I reached out to him a few months ago, and he gave me permission to utilize the information, but I'm making sure that I give him the credit for it. So we're looking at Brother AARON EGGMAN's book, The Saints Go Up and the Wrath Comes Down, and this particular blog post or chapter or paragraph heading is entitled The Coming of Jesus and the Rapture. And we've already started into this, so let's pick this up from where we left off last week. Here's where we really left off. This is a chart, and it is a definition of the coming of Jesus, the coming of the coming of Jesus, or the Parousia. And we did read this, but we're going to read it one more time so we can move into the section seamlessly. The coming of Jesus begins when the sign of the Son of Man appears in the sky, in which every eye will see Jesus coming on the clouds of heaven. At this time, Jesus sends forth his angels to gather his saints to meet him in the clouds. After his initial appearing, the coming of Jesus refers to the pouring out of his wrath on the earth and his arrival on a white horse with the armies of heaven for the Battle of Armageddon. Let's now read more details about this Parousia as seen through the book, The Saints Go Up and the Wrath Comes Down by Brother AARON EGGMAN. Here's what he has to say. The Parousia will span from Jesus' initial coming on the clouds and continue into eternity. Revelation 1:7 also references Jesus' second coming in association with clouds. When John recorded those words, he was making a reference to Jesus' words found in Matthew 24:30. Let's look at Revelation 1:7. These are words that John the Revelator wrote. Quote, "Look, He's coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all peoples on the earth will mourn because of him. So shall it be. Amen. We also have, following on the heels of that, the passage from Matthew to reinforce John's reference to the cloud rider. Notice what it says, quote, Matthew 24:30, Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Then all of the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So we can see that these two verses are referencing the same event, unless one is to imagine that there's either A, two separate cloud riding events that are separated by some time frame, or B, that the rapture and the second coming are actually the same event, like post-tribbers might imagine. Here's what Brother Eggman says. Every eye will see Jesus coming on the clouds of heaven when he returns, right? Matthew 24:30, Revelation 1:7. Jesus' coming will not be a hidden event. Jesus explains what his coming would be like in Luke 17:24, again, emphasizing that everyone would know. So now he's utilizing verses that will really indicate that this is not a secret event. Luke 17:24. The Son of Man in his day will be like lightning, which flashes and lights up the sky from one end to the other. Here's what Brother Eggman says. The beginning of the Parousia will be a public proclamation to the whole world that his kingdom is coming and cannot be stopped. It will be accompanied by a loud command with the voice of an archangel and with a trumpet call, right? Recall 1 Thessalonians 4:16-17. We might even quote that later on, we'll see. Brother Eggman continues, At this time, all Christians, whether dead or alive, will be raised up to him in the clouds. The world will watch as this takes place. They will see believers vanish from the earth before their eyes as they are taken from the earth to be with Jesus. Matthew 24:40. The prophet Daniel also saw a vision in which Jesus appeared coming on clouds. And this is really important, so pay attention. Here's our quote, Daniel 7:13. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. Now let's read Brother Eggman's response. This is his comment on the Daniel passage we just read. Jesus disappeared in a cloud when he ascended into heaven after spending 40 days on earth, teaching his disciples following his resurrection. An angel reassured the shocked disciples watching the scene that Jesus would return in the very same way.